Welcome to California Highways Route by Route. This podcast explores everything about the numbered highways in California, from Route 1 along the coast to US 395 along the Sierras, from Route 8 in the south to Route 139 in the north.
Brought to you by the California Highways webpage and Gribblenation.
I'm Daniel Fagan, the maintainer of the California Highways webpage.
I'm Tom Fear from Gribblenation.
This is episode 1.01, Before 1920, Building a State Highway System. So, when you think of California, what comes to mind? The Golden Gate Bridge? Well, there's a highway across it. State parks like Yosemite? Highways take you there. Los Angeles and San Francisco? They are, for a good sense, defined by their freeways or their hatred of freeways. The California coast? Well, there's a highway there as well.
Highways define the state. They enable commerce, they enable tourism, they help build and connect cities, they contribute to growth.
But California didn't always have a state highway system. Before we can dig into all the routes in the state, which is what this podcast is going to do, going route by route, some background is necessary. So this episode is the start of that. And in this first year, we're going to be going into how California got its highway system, what the differences are between the highways in the states, how highways are numbered, where highways get their names, and the organizations and processes behind the highways. Hopefully, this will reduce how much we need to repeat things as we're going through all of our route definitions, and we'll answer some common questions. And our goal this year is to hit those key inflection points that shape our later discussions. So, if we look at where California was before 1895, there weren't many roads in the state. This was a rural state. The first roads were horse trails and wagon roads, and most California road building was being done by local governments or by private toll road operators. Statehood happened in 1850, and there began to be pressure for improved roads. There was an Office of Surveyor General created with the duty to suggest roads, but it really didn't have any funding to do anything other than make suggestions. In 1855, demand started for a road that went from the Sacramento Valley to the Carson Valley in Nevada. And the first highway bill was passed to survey a good wagon road over the Sierra Nevada mountains. I still remember an article in the Fedco Reporter talking about this. It authorized bids for construction of what became the Emigrant Wagon Road, authorized costs up to $105,000, but of course the legislature never actually appropriated that money. And the result was just franchises for toll roads. And this led to our first state roads. No system or anything, just roads. The Emigrant Wagon Road, which was also the Lake Tahoe Wagon Road, which was completed in November 1858. And in 1864, the railroads completed the Dutch Flat and Donner Lake Wagon Road over the Sierras. And Tom, if I'm correct, this is what eventually became US 40 and then I-80?
Yes, correct. That's actually what became the North Branch of the Lincoln Highway, Victory Highway, and US 40.
So that's your first state highway right there.
This is when the Good Roads movement was starting nationally. Founded in 1880 in Rhode Island, the movement went national. In 1892, began publishing Good Roads magazine. In 3 years, circulation reached 1 million. 1892, began publishing Good Roads magazine. In 3 years, circulation reached 1 million. In 1893, the U.S. Department of Agriculture initiated a systematic evaluation of existing highway systems. Also in 1893, Charles Durrell produced the first American gasoline-powered vehicle, and rural free delivery began. Around 1910, AAA and the Auto Club of Southern California joined the Good Roads movement.
We brought in a guest speaker to talk on the Good Roads movement, Adam Prince from Gribblenation. Let Adam say a little bit about the Good Roads movement.
So the Good Roads movement was a nationwide movement throughout the country, north, south, east, and west. Obviously, in California, they pushed for good roads, but it was throughout the United States. And what you saw was a number of good road conventions throughout states. Where I'm from in North Carolina, there was a strong push of that. In fact, there was a lady by the name of Harriet Berry. She was a cartographer with at North Carolina Geological Survey, and she started as a stenographer, and she became director. And this was around the turn of the century. And you had statewide movements, and I'm specific to North Carolina here, that really pushed for legislation to improve roads, a lot of them farm to market, ranch to market, but town to town. In some cases, speaking again in North Carolina, was from sometimes county seat to county seat. But that was part of the Good Road movement. A lot of traveling associations had the Lincoln Highway Association, the Dixie Highway Association in the South. You had that also joined in, as you said, Tom, with the AAA of California and elsewhere. So it was really a nationwide, and it was considered very progressive. You had a lot of also, the progressive movement of that time at that time period in the turn of the century was gaining a lot of steam, and the Good Roads movement was a subset of it.
As Adam noted, there were a lot of conferences from the Good Roads movement, and in particular, a conference in February 1895 urged Californians to keep up the pressure on lawmakers to commit to a program of road improvement. I'd like to thank Adam for joining us. If you want to stay on, Adam, for the rest of our discussion, you're more than welcome. I understand you're on the East Coast and you want to head off to dinner. So if you want to do that,
I may stay on for a little bit, just for a minute or two. But I appreciate you guys having me on. And like I said, the Good Roads movement really was a start, was a culmination of a lot of things that really pushed for eventually, a national network of highways, later into the 20th century. So thanks again.
Okay, thank you. And now let's continue with the chronology.
1895 was a big year in California. The Bureau of Highways was created and provided for the appointment of 3 competent persons to compose the Bureau of Highways during a 2-year statutory life. The purpose was to hold public meetings in each county and collect information from the counties on local roads. The Bureau of Highways also examined the geography and topography of the state, assessing the water supply and availability of road building materials, as well as preparing standard plans for bridges, culverts, and other features that could be used by the counties for their own road projects. Bureau of Highways inventoried all available highways in the state. Before the state system was created, major roads were typically built as toll road franchises. Toll road franchises were typically granted in 25-year periods, where maintenance would defer to a local authority. Franchise toll rights often were abandoned due to being unprofitable, being sold. It did not have a standard design. The toll road system led to major variations in the quality and maintenance along major highways in California. The Bureau of Highways findings: the existing roads were poor as a result of neglect and apathy. Estimated $18 million of public money had been squandered on worthless highway projects since 1885. Recommended the state should construct routes as counties were too cash-strapped to construct and maintain roads on their own. Bureau of Highways recommended a system of state highways made up of 28 distinct routes of approximately 4,500 miles using existing roads when possible to connect all county seats. Was to be funded by property tax, 1/4 of 1 mil on every dollar of assessed property in the state. Went before the legislature in 1897.
Let me note that, first of all, 1 mil is 1/10 of a cent, so it's really negligible. Tom, have you ever seen a map of what those 28 routes were going to be?
There is actually a published map of them in the, I believe, September 1950 volume of the California Highways and Public Works.
How close was that to some of the routes we know today? Do you recall?
It was very close. They were pretty much spot on what the major highways were going to be even back then.
The legislature modified that bill. They allowed pretty much any road, no matter how insignificant, to be classified as a state highway. They changed it so the proceeds of that really small tax went directly to the counties with no accountability or little accountability. And these changes resulted in the legislation being vetoed, and the Bureau of Highways went out of existence after 2 years. They tried, but not much happened.
However, in 1885, the legislature did define the first state highway, which was the Lake Tahoe Wagon Road. Specifically, an act that authorized the state of California to secure the title and right-of-way for a certain wagon road commencing the short distance easterly from the village of Smith's Flat near Placerville and running hence to Lake Tahoe. Lake Tahoe Wagon Road was completed between 1857 and 1865 as a major highway over the Sierra Nevada mountains via Johnson's Pass. We would know this today as largely Echo Summit on U.S. Route 50. Also, the Mariposa Wagon Road, specifically, an act to appropriate money for the survey, location, and construction of a free wagon road from the town of Mariposa and Mariposa County to Yosemite Valley. We would know this today, even though this didn't really do much to appropriate building this road, as California State Route 140 or the El Portal Road. At the time, in the 1890s, you had a bunch of franchise toll roads that went to Yosemite, namely the Wawona Road, the Coulterville Road, and the Big Oak Flat Road. In 1897, the Department of Highways was created, continued to work at the Bureau of Highways, and took ownership of the Lake Tahoe Wagon Road.
More highways followed that. In 1897, the Folsom Highway was extended to provide construction of a state highway or wagon road from Sacramento City to Folsom. And we think of these as short distances now, but they were big distances back then before cars. In 1899, the Mono Lake Basin State Road was created, which was a free wagon road from Mono Lake to connect with the Tioga Road or near the Tioga Mine. So this is up in the area near Bridgeport over Tioga. And then there was the Sonora to Mono Wagon State Road in 1901, which declared part of the Sonora and Mono Wagon Road commencing east of Sonora to a point known as Long Barn, running across the summit of the Sierra Nevadas to Bridgeport, a state highway. And I think that's Route 108, if I recall.
That's correct. That is Sonora Pass.
Okay.
In 1902, a constitutional amendment approved establishing the legislature's authority to create a highway system. Specifically, a resolution proposing to the people of the state of California amendment to the Constitution by adding a new section, Article 4 thereof, relating to establishing state highways and providing for the construction and maintenance thereof. Prior to this, the state might acquire roads, but they couldn't build or maintain them.
Which almost makes no sense of being able to get a road, but you can't maintain it. But this was a good idea. Then we had more highways following. So in 1903, and we're seeing the system slowly grow. In 1903, we had the Trinity to Humboldt State Highway, which went from a point on the Trinity River westerly down the river about 40 miles to connect with the existing road in Humboldt County. My hit is saying that's Route 96.
That's actually 299.
299, okay. In 1905, we had the Kings River Canyon State Road, which was a public highway from General Grant Park to Kings River Canyon, and that's currently Route
180.
180. So I don't have all the maps in my head. Tom's a little bit more familiar with that area.
In 1907, the Sierra State Highway was added. Specifically, Sierra State Highway was added as an act to make for the appropriation for the location, survey, construction of the state highway from a point known as Mount Pleasant Ranch on the road between Quincy and Marysville, then southeasterly direction by Eureka to Downeyville in Sierra County. This is what would have been the first California State Route 194. Also in 1907, Peanut to Kuntz, an act provided for the survey, location, and construction of the state highway connecting to the present county road system of any one or all counties of Trinity, Tehama, and Shasta with the road system in Humboldt County. We would know this as California State Route 36 today. In 1909, Emigrant Gap State Road, an act to make for the appropriation, location, and construction of the state highway from Emigrant Gap to the west end of Donner Lake. This would become later US 40 and later still Interstate 80.
There's some things to note about the early days, and you can see this here. The highways were pretty much defined piecemeal. It wasn't an organized system. The existing roads were really poor. Outside of a city, the roads were dirt or gravel, mud in the winter, dust in the summer. In terms of the state-funded roads, it's interesting to note that there were really no state-funded highways south of Fresno. We think of Los Angeles as this big city today, but back then it was really just a tiny little dusty town. And the major part of the state focus was San Francisco, points north. And there were no major north-south highways being funded. Most of these highways being funded were mountain crossings, because that's where the state money was most useful.
Yeah, and you just look at the population patterns of that time frame, like in the Sierra Nevada mountains and those gold communities, they made up a much more significant part of the overall state population than today by a large margin.
Yeah, California was dominated by the North. LA and San Diego were really tiny towns. The coast didn't need wagon roads. They had the sea lanes. You could travel by the ocean. And the focus was really on rural roads. But this changed in 1909.
Major change came with the 1909 bond issue. The 1909 First State Highway Bond Act for $18 million was approved by voters in 1910. It established a state highway system, authorized construction of 3,052 miles of state highway, required the Department of Engineering to acquire the necessary land and construct continuous connected highway system. The first construction project, paving the segment of El Camino Real in Burlingame, south of San Francisco, in San Mateo County. The highway was eventually designated as U.S. Route 101. Bonds for the First State Highway Bond Act were paid off in July of 1961 with total interest of a little bit over $18 million.
This highway system defined just over 30, I want to say, legislative routes. They weren't numbered at the time, but they were defined in the code of the Bond Act. They weren't signed. They weren't numbered. They didn't include any portions within the cities. And some of the notable routes still around today that were defined included San Francisco to Crescent City, which is part of US 101, San Francisco to San Diego, again, US 101, Sacramento to Oregon and Sacramento to Los Angeles, which is mostly along US 99, Stockton to Santa Cruz via Oakland, which is now portions of what were 680, 880, 17, and a number of other routes, Sacramento to Woodland, which was US 40, San Fernando to San Bernardino, which is actually nowadays what is 118 and what was US 66, Sacramento to Placerville, which is US 50, San Diego to El Centro, which is what became I-8, and Saugus to Bridgeport, which is what became US 395. So our major routes were defined at that time.
There was early on a national auto trail system. Basically, this is like the pre-runner to state routes and U.S. routes. So basically what auto trails were, you had like a long trail across several states or an area that would be signed by an auto trail association. Some of the more notable ones that existed in California were the Pacific Highway, which was begun in 1913, the Lincoln Highway, also begun in 1913, the National Old Trails Road, which was begun in 1912, and the Old Spanish Trail Association, which was begun in 1915. We'll do a special episode on auto trails at some point. A lot of them became major highways that people know today, and really they deserve their own feature because we could just go into an endless loop talking about them.
One thing I think to note about the auto trails, though, is how people were directed to drive them. In other words, nowadays you get nice maps that have numbered highways and you have good old trailblazers and markers along the route. On the auto trail era, it was very much a go to the barn on the right, you make a left here, and then you go to the third rock and you make a right there. And it was really sometimes hard to follow them, and they weren't signed well.
Yeah, then that really didn't start getting standardized for quite some time. Some of the auto trail associations that were more proficient than others, namely the National Old Trails Road, came to an agreement with like the Automobile Club of Southern California to develop maps that we would know as modern, but that was more of an exception than it was a rule.
The system that we had established in 1909 was tweaked a bit in 1911 and 1913. This is also where we start getting what our Caltrans divisions are now. We had 7 divisions created in the Division of Highways. Some of the previously authorized highways were created in the new system. So we have things like the Lassen State Highway and the Alpine State Highway. 1913 saw a few more highways added. The California Redwood Park State Road, which was a highway from the Saratoga Gap on the line between the counties of Santa Clara and Santa Cruz into and within California Redwood Park. I want to say that's Route 9.
It was 9, and this is the original iteration of 9. It's mostly 236 now through Big Basin State Park.
Yep. And then the Bakersfield, Maricopa, and Ventura Road, which went all the way from Bakersfield through Kern, San Luis Obispo, Santa Barbara, and Ventura into the city of Ventura. That became US 399 and today is Route 33 and is a really interesting drive.
Yeah, it's probably one of the more fun ones in the system, too.
1915, we saw another bond issue take place, and that defined a lot more highways. A number of highways that were already allocated were taken into the state system, and notably, there was the Pasadena State Highway, which is what eventually became the Pasadena Freeway.
More notable features of the 1915 State Highway Bond Act. $15 million were authorized to be distributed via bonds, authorized 702 additional miles of highway, provided explicit definitions for the routes. Final payment of the 1915 bonds were made during July of 1963 for approximately $16 million in interest having been paid.
It's interesting to note that for both bond acts, the total interest was almost equal or more than what the bond act was.
Yeah, coincidentally, you kind of wonder how that works with inflation. I'm kind of tempted to bust out my inflation calculator and see. A numbered list of routes were now maintained by the Department of Highways, but were not defined legislatively and not really publicized out of some rare exceptions like early variations of state highway maps published by the California Highway Commission.
Those had the list of numbers on them?
They did.
Was there a lot of difference between those numbers and what eventually became the legislative routes?
Not particularly, but the definitions on the maps are usually much more simplified.
I'll note that you can find links to a lot of these old state highway maps in the Maps Tell a Story section out on cahighways.org. That's usually where I end up starting to find them. Some of the notable routes that came with the second bond issue included extensions to the Saugus to LA route, which connected Antelope Valley to the county of LA. There was an extension of the route from San Bernardino to Yuma via El Centro, which went basically lateral, which means sideways to the Arizona state line near Yuma via the cities of Brawley and El Centro. And that lateral doesn't make sense because that would be US 99 from San Bernardino. So it's parallel to the Arizona state line.
Right. It's a combination of 99 and US 80. If that this is really confusing. Like this ends up being legislative route 26 and 27. I think that's how they made more sense of that. So it's basically it goes almost south and turns directly east towards Yuma.
And then the other route that came in was from San Bernardino to Barstow, which was an extension of the San Bernardino County state line, lateral to Barstow. They love the word lateral in San Bernardino County by the most direct and practical route. Now, if you're thinking San Bernardino to Barstow, you're talking what became US 395 through the Cajon Pass. Now, at the federal level, there were a lot of things going on. In 1916, President Wilson signed the Federal Aid Road Act, also known as the Bankhead-Shackelford Act or the Goods Road Act. This, I think, was one of the first acts where you started seeing federal funding provided for rural post roads. But they had to be open to the public at no charge. Okay, previously you used to have a lot of toll roads. Funding was distributed to the states based on a formula incorporating geographic area, population, and the existing road network. States were required to submit project plans, surveys, specs, and estimates to the Secretary of Agriculture, and it provided up to $75 million in federal funds in a 50-50 matching funds approach for the states to build up to 6% of their roads statewide over a 5-year period.
So what's interesting is I used to hear quite a bit of talk in the road community about why roads back in the day, so to speak, used to not have tolls. Well, there you go. If you're getting federal contributions and it's making financial sense to build those roads in that manner, it would make sense. And you kind of see that in the next couple decades, similar methodologies with federal funding on federal aid. Between 1917 and 1919, continual tweaks were made to the state highway system. Several additions to the system were added. 1917 defined more roads, such as San Bernardino to the east end of Big Bear Lake. This would have been known at the time as Crest Drive, or as we know today as Rim of the World Highway in California, State Route 18. Susanville to Nevada. This would be part of what is now US 395. 1919, Truckee to the Nevada state line. Basically, this would have been a replacement for Hennis Pass Highway, which was incorporated into the early Northern Lincoln Highway and Victory Highway via replacement by what became US Route 40. Really, we're just hitting a summary of notable highways. There was a lot of others created.
We had a third bond issue in 1919 for $40 million, and this authorized creation or extension of another 18,000 miles of highway, a little bit more than that. It extended the funding for completions of highways contemplated under the earlier acts by the addition of $20 million and provided an additional $20 million for some additional routes. This was paid off in 1965, and again, the price for the interest was more than the original bond. It was about almost $45 million in interest was paid on this.
Some additional major Third State Highway Bond Act issue routes. The Klamath River Highway, which would have became California State Route 96, between Route 3, which became US Route 99, and Route 1, which became US Route 101. Carmel to San Simeon. This would be notable because this is now California State Route 1 through Big Sur. Mojave to Needles via Barstow. This became US Route 466, and we know this today as California State Route 58.
Note also that the segment between Barstow and Needles was eventual US 66.
San Juan Capistrano to Oxnard. This would have been the original California State Route 3, which became US Route 101A, and is now California State Route 1. La Cañada to Mount Wilson Road via Arroyo Seco. This would be now part of California State Route 2, otherwise known as the Angeles Crest Highway. Mecca to Blythe. This would have been the original alignment of US Route 60 through Box Canyon, which was later part of US Route 70. It was later realigned out of Box Canyon. It became California State Route 195.
Note also that the segment that went from Indio out to Blythe was later US 60 and US 70 and later became I-10. And I'll just note it took a long time to build some of these. You've got Carmel to San Simeon here, and that includes Big Sur, which took a lot of effort to build. And we'll touch upon that when we eventually get to talking about Route 1 in the second season. There's one additional interesting thing that happened in 1919 that probably seemed insignificant at the time. There was the first U.S. Army transcontinental motor convoy in the summer of 1919 on the Lincoln Highway, with 81 motorized Army vehicles going from Washington, D.C. to San Francisco. This covered a little over 3,000 miles, 3,251 miles in 61 days. So imagine what the roads were like for it to take 61 days. Nowadays, you can drive across the country in what, about 5 or 6 days?
I've done it in 2.
You've done it in 2, yeah. In 61 days is a test of wartime mobility. One of the participants on this was Lieutenant Colonel Dwight Eisenhower, and this trip, combined with his experiences in World War II, seeing the highways in Germany, is led to his support for the Interstate Highway Act. Now, we'll see in future episodes that he doesn't deserve all the credit for that act. The act was had the foundations laid during the Roosevelt administration, but he really championed it. This is a good stopping point for the first episode. We're sort of dividing the chronology up into major epics. It sort of aligns to what I have out on the highway pages. And so we're going to stop at the end of 1919 because the 1920s bring some really big changes. We see a gas tax added. We see the Melville Act, where the state can take over traversable highways through small cities that can't afford them. It didn't have to just focus on the rural highways between the cities. We see U.S. highway system come into play. We see the Breed Bill come into play, which is one of the first gas taxes. And we see a lot of reorganization about the state offices. Before we go into the closing out, Tom, do you want to add any other observations on this before 1919 era?
It really is, I think, the most interesting era in the state highway system because this is just such a revolutionary change. And you hit on it earlier with just how long it would take to get places. You got to really understand that we're talking about like basically roads that people would probably not even consider walking trails today, transforming into something that we would recognize as modern. This is really where it all started, was during those first 3 state highway bond acts.
I mean, if we were to think about it today, right, we think nothing about driving Los Angeles to Sacramento. It's a good 6-7 hour drive, no problem. Back then, how long would LA to Sacramento take?
Several days at least.
So this was transformative in the history of the state, I think. For more information, take a look at the chronology section over on cahighways.org. Most of the blogs that Tom has done over on Gribblenation really touch on the early days. He has a lot of good information on the named auto trails, emergence into the roads, into some of the history of the LRNs. And I know for a number of these routes, you focus on what the toll roads were and how they came into being.
Yeah, it's interesting to try to find them. There's not a lot of reliable information. There's not like a really solid log on what existed. So a lot of times I feel like we're finding stuff that people just forgot about even existing, but really ended up evolving into major corridors.
The Santa Clarita Valley History site had a good article on the origins of the Good Roads movement. We will link to that in the show notes. And we'll have other links to the relevant information over on the page at caroutebyroute.org. And of course, for details on specific routes that we've mentioned, just go to the specific route pages over on cahighways.org or over on gribblenation.org.
As always, information on this episode is available on our website, caroutebyroute.org, where you can also leave us a comment on each episode. This episode is also available on our Anchor FM home, anchor.fm/CA Route by Route. Join us as we continue to explore California highways route by route.
Just a few credits. Tom and I wrote the episode. I will edit it. The opening thing is I Like to Be by the Seaside by John H. Glover Klein. We're always looking for a new opening theme. If you've got one and it's in the public domain or you'll let us use it for free, please let me know. You can contact me at daniel@caroutebyroute.org. We record our episodes using freeconferencecall.com. I'd like to thank Nanook Burkholder for helping me do the audio editing. This podcast is a product of California Highways at cahighways.org and Gribblenation at gribblenation.org. And if you're interested in becoming a supporter of the podcast, once we've got that set up, please let me know. I'm Daniel at caroutebyroute.org.